Lord, open her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. Please be seated. I don't remember what my first conversation with Michael was, but it probably started with a question, most likely about what was up with the collar or my long hair, or why I was there at the bagel with the works in Portsmouth at 6:30 a.m. on a Sunday. This is someone who I had seen week in and week out. I'd recently started a new routine on Sunday mornings. I realized that before getting to church for the 8 a.m. service and to make it through the 10 a.m., I needed something substantial in my body. And so hence on my way to go and to make sure my sermon was in shape and everything was ready, I would stop at the Bagel Works in downtown Portsmouth to get an everything bagel with veggie cream cheese. And at 6:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, week in and week out, you notice the particular rhythm of the place. And I noticed that there was one table in the middle of the dining area where there was always the same group of guys, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, sometimes there's just 2 or 3 of them, sometimes 10 of them. There was one guy in particular who was always there, week in, week out, rain, shine, sun, or snow, whatever the weather was, he was there. Whenever your routine happens to intersect with someone else's, you notice each other time in, time out, inevitably there's going to be a conversation. And so at some point, Michael took that first step and said, "What are you doing? What's your deal?" And so, I explained on the priest of the Episcopal Church, and it led to another conversation the next week, and another one the next week. We moved on from the basic details of each other's lives, where I would walk in, Michael would have a news article that he wanted to get my take on, or he would have something to report about his most recent experience and his practice of Zen meditation, or he'd have something to report about his relationship with his grandkids, or just some other tidbit of what was going on in his life. And inevitably he or one of the other guys with him would ask me, "So what are you preaching about today?" And I'd give them the 2-minute version of my sermon. And I know that if I couldn't give a 2-minute version of it, I was in pretty rough shape for what was to come later in the morning. Over time, we built a relationship, me and this group of guys, particularly Michael. There was one guy who would always ask me to say prayers for the Red Sox or the Celtics or whatever Boston sports team was in a special need of prayers that Sunday. And we'd talk about life. I'd give them my take on the sermon. They'd share whatever was going on in their minds or would respond to it. And there's this funny thing. I stopped there to get a bagel for nourishment. That was the goal of this visit at 6:30 on Sunday mornings. And yet I found myself leaving more time for the works. I came to refer to it as my early service. But I got as much out of that engagement as maybe they did, or if not more. Because for me, it was a chance to talk about what I was going to talk about later that morning with a group of folks who weren't going to be in church, but were curious and were open and had listening ears and were willing to hear me out, curious about me, and I got to learn more about them. And this sort of stop that was on my way to what I thought was an important thing became a part of my day, a part of my life, part of my week. In our reading from Acts today, Paul has another vision. This vision, he's there, and all of a sudden appears to him a man from Macedonia. It's not entirely clear how he knows this is a Macedonian, but we trust that Paul has his ways. This Macedonian says, "Come to us and help us. We need you." And so Paul, coming to after this vision, goes to his companions. They're in Troas, which is on the western coast of Turkey, and says, well, we gotta go to Macedonia. And so they pack up, they load up in a ship, and they make the 150-mile journey to Macedonia based on this man appearing to them in a vision. We hear that they make their way to Samothrace, cruise through the cities of Macedonia until they end up at Philippi. And they're there for a few days. You get the sense that they're just trying to figure out, what does this vision mean? What are we called to do? What are we doing in Macedonia? And then on the Sabbath morning, they make their way outside the gates of the city. Something compels them to go out of the city, to seek out a place down by the river, in hopes that they would find people praying there. I can imagine Paul is in this place being like, well, Lord, come on. You've given me this vision. You've shown me this Macedonian man. He said he needs help. Show him to me. And maybe if we go down on the Sabbath, down by the river, that's where the vision will be realized. They end up down by the river. And instead of the man from Macedonia, we find a group of women praying there. And instead of moving on, hoping that the vision will be realized somewhere else, Paul himself sits down. He sits down and begins to tell them the story. The story of Jesus of Nazareth, who taught in the synagogues, who healed, who cast out demons, who brought people back from the dead. The story of Jesus of Nazareth, who was put to death by his own people and by the Roman authorities. The story of Jesus of Nazareth, who was raised from the dead on the third day. The story of Jesus of Nazareth, who appeared to him in a vision on the road to Damascus, who flung him from his horse, struck him blind, but then who called him to be an apostle. Paul tells the women this story, and one of them, Lydia, hears it, and the story takes root within her. We're told that the Lord opened her heart so that she could intently listen to the words of Paul. We hear that she is a worshiper of God, a Gentile woman who is intrigued by, interested in, who is drawn for some reason to the God of Israel. And here, as she hears Paul talking, as she hears Paul telling the story, something clicks. She realizes this is what she had been waiting for. What she had been hoping for coming down to the river, what the Spirit had been driving her towards. So she is baptized along with her whole household. She goes on to invite Paul and his companions to come and stay with her. This is not the realization of the vision that Paul had in mind. This is not the man from Macedonia he pictured coming to help. But he went where the Spirit led him. First to Macedonia, then out of the gates of the city of Philippi, down by the river. He sat down and he taught as the Spirit led him. It's not the way he would have expected things to play out. It's not the end that he had in mind, but it's where the Spirit led him. Similarly with Lydia, we're told that she was a seller of purple cloth. Purple was a royal color. These would have been expensive fabrics and garments. She's clearly a woman of means, someone who is living just fine independently. She has and is managing her own household. She has her own business. She has her own resources, enough to continue to invite Paul and his companions in to host them whenever they're in town. And yet still something drove her out to the river to gather with the other women in prayer. Something led her to listen intently, to open her heart to the words that Paul was speaking. The same Spirit that opened her heart was the same Spirit that led Paul out to the river. It was in that place where the two of them, led by the Spirit, found their lives connected, intertwined, meeting in a way that would transform both of them. It would lead to Paul's foundation of the church there in Philippi, and to Lydia's own transformation, giving her life to this newfound faith. When looking at this kind of meeting, There are kind of two extremes you could chalk it up to. On the one hand, there's to view it as a series of interesting coincidences. Wasn't it wild that Paul had this vision and went to Macedonia, ended up there by this river, found this group of women, and one of them happened to really take to what he had to say. Isn't it an interesting coincidence that this Lydia, this woman who seems to have it all together, who has her own resources, her means, that she happened to go out to the river that day, that she happened to hear what Paul had to say, it happened to take hold of her, she happened to be able to support this new church. Then on the other hand, on the other extreme, you could read this all as part of the divine plan. Everything happens for a reason. It's all in God's plan. God knew, and God moved Paul from Troas to Macedonia. God led Lydia out there to the river. And God made all of this happen, moving them like pawns, like pieces on a chessboard, making sure each was in place exactly where it was supposed to be. I think either of those misses the whole picture and the power of this story. But somewhere between those extremes, there is a vision of what happens. It is very much about the movement of the Holy Spirit and people's willingness to respond, to say yes. It was the Holy Spirit that met Paul in his vision and showed him this image of the man of Macedonia. It was the Holy Spirit that urged him to leave Troas and to go where the vision led him. It was the Holy Spirit that led him, that nudged him and his companions outside the gates of the city. At each step along the way, Paul said yes. He said yes to going to the places where he didn't expect to go. He said yes to going to those places where he felt God's Spirit leading him. Not that he had to, or was forced to, or just happened to by coincidence. And he heard the Spirit speaking, said yes. Same with Lydia. Something compelled her to go out of the city that day and to end up down by the river. She said yes. She felt something stir within her as she heard the words of St. Paul. She said yes. She felt the pull to be baptized. She said yes. This is a story of the Holy Spirit at work in the world around these people, nudging them forward to follow where it is that God is leading. Not that they are forced or compelled against their will or made to move like pieces on a chessboard. And these things don't just happen to occur. They are suffused with and imbued with a sense of God's Spirit and work in the lives of the people in. People who are willing to open their hearts and to say yes. And as a result, they have this grace to encounter one another. They find their lives meeting each other. They find that the Holy Spirit has brought them together and allowed them to be transformed through the encounter. In March of 2020, my trips to Babel Works before the 8 o'clock service came to an end. And it was only then, when this routine halted, that I realized how much it had come to mean to me. More than just getting a bagel to start my morning. It was about that interaction, that community, the fact that somehow my life had become intertwined with the lives of these folks who also found themselves at the works at 6:30 a.m. on a Sunday. I found myself praying for the Red Sox, which is something that I never expected in my life to do. And found myself fed by these interactions. And so as I look at it, was it coincidence that we all found ourselves there, sitting over bagels and coffee on Sunday mornings? Was it some divinely ordained plan where we are moved there by the will of God alone? Or was it that something moved in our spirits? Have that first conversation with one another. To take the time out of our mornings to check in, to see how each other were doing, to share what we had been thinking about, to offer the 2-minute version of my sermon. So the Holy Spirit nudged us into meeting one another, and we all simply said yes. I think of so many of the graced encounters that I've had in my life. Those moments of meeting someone, not out of my own intention or careful planning, but simply out of the Holy Spirit putting us in each other's paths. I think the incredible hospitality that I've been shown while traveling abroad, or the chance encounters I've had with folks at a time when I really needed it, or maybe they needed it as well. I think of the times that I felt that the Spirit has led me places that I didn't expect to go, and led me to encounter folks, people in my past who were exactly the people who I needed to meet at the right time. In our gospel, when Jesus talks about giving the gift of the Holy Spirit, he's assuring the disciples that something will be with them. He will be with them, that his presence will continue with them, that they won't be left alone in this world, unguided, unled. But that the Holy Spirit would be there with them, nudging them, urging them forward, telling them to go places they may not want to go or may not expect to go. And God will be with them. And I think the invitation in our gospel and also in our Acts reading is to open ourselves to those nudges from the Holy Spirit. To open ourselves to the Holy Spirit, urging us to go places we wouldn't expect, to take the extra few minutes to open ourselves to another person, to let God's love reveal itself to us through the world around us, through the people who we encounter. May we, like Lydia, like Paul, open ourselves to the workings of the Holy Spirit. May we never be so stuck in our own ways of seeing, our own ways of thinking, our own plans for how things ought to be. We fail to feel those nudges, those urgings, those, I think, encouragement of the Holy Spirit. May we open ourselves to God's presence, working in us and through us. May we open ourselves to the Holy Spirit, creating others in our path. And through it, may we discover that we live in a world that is suffused with God's presence, God's light, with the Spirit encouraging us on, encouraging us to reach out to one another in love, encouraging us to open our hearts to all whose paths cross and intertwine.